in Flanders Fields by Charles Ives. Welcome everyone to tonight's Twitter Space. It is the end of day 25 of the war in Ukraine, and I'm Dmitry Alperovich, chairman of Solar Policy Accelerator, a geopolitical think tank in Washington, D.C. And tonight I'm joined once again by Michael Kofman, an expert on the Russian military and research program director in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis. We also have with us tonight, for the first time, Andrew Monaghan, author of The New Politics of Russia, Interpreting Change, and a senior fellow at the Kennan Institute, Royal United Services Institute, and NATO Defense College. So today, in addition to the military campaign analysis with Mike, we'll do a deep dive on the Russian politics with Andrew to hopefully figure out what is happening in the Kremlin right now as their invasion of Ukraine drags on. So welcome, Andrew, and great to have you back, Mike. Mike, let's start with you. So today, Secretary of Defense Austin said that Russia's campaign is, quote, stalled, unquote. First, do you agree with that characterization? And maybe talk about what is happening right now on the various fronts of this campaign, the fight for Mariupol, the push towards Odessa, Russia's attempt to surround the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, and of course, the push towards Kiev. And also, what is going on with the Ukraine counteroffensive? Are they actually taking back territory?
Thanks, Dmitry. I guess my upfront disappointing answer to that is going to be yes and no. So if we look around what we can imperfectly describe as three distinct fronts, in the north around Kiev, it's clear that Russian forces are very much struggling to complete any kind of encirclement. I don't think they're in a position to conduct an assault on Kiev. I'm growing skeptical about the upcoming Battle of Kiev, as some people have called it. Maybe that's something that might happen in a follow-on phase of this war, but I'm just not seeing it right now. And they're mostly looking to consolidate territory on the eastern side of the riverbank, maybe trying to still encircle and get around the city of Chernihiv. If we look in the southwest, the Russian attempt to get around the city of Mykolaiv to try to chart a path to Odessa, that always had a low probability of success. There was a real paucity of forces available for it. It seems the Ukrainian counteroffensive has really cut into their supply lines there and pushed them back towards Kherson. Now that front is largely stalled, and if anything, they're probably trying to fix Ukrainian positions there, but I don't expect any progress there at all. So that leaves us with really one area to focus on, which is in the eastern part of the country, in the Donbass, the Ukrainian Joint Forces operation there. There's quite a few units. Russian forces have been trying to pincer them via two attacks, one coming down south of Kharkiv to a city called Izum, another one coming up north from Melitopol, right? So we have that situation. That is where Ukrainian forces, if they're precarious in any place, that's definitely the part of the map that looks very challenging for them. And then, of course, we have the battle to take Mariupol as well, along the coast of the Sea of Azov. There, if Russian forces do end up taking it, it's been very bloody. If any part of this war so far looks like an analogy to Grozny or the Chechen War, is definitely that one. I would say that's the one city likely to potentially fall. But to me, that's in of itself, that's not that significant. The more significant part, if there's any movement on the front, it's the attempt to encircle a large part of Ukrainian forces in the east. So in general, I would say that, yes, it's true that most Russian acts of advance have stalled. A couple of weeks ago, I predicted the Russian forces would be around this time reaching exhaustion and a high degree of combat and effectiveness, and without a big operational pause to replenish, resupply, reorganize, they would have major issues making progress. It's kind of looking like that's the way things are going. That, of course, doesn't mean the war in any way is over. It just means that maybe this initial phase or chapter of the war is over. As for Ukrainian counterattacks, they've had some success a little bit outside of Kiev on the eastern side, and the main counteroffensive around Mykolaiv. And that's led to somewhat a shifting battlefield. I guess that's all I'll say there. I'm happy to add more. I just don't want to drone on because it's such a big topic.
Yeah, one thing that puzzles me, maybe you can shed some light on this, is it seems like they're really, really serious about taking Mariupol in a way that they haven't been with Kiev, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, all these other cities that they've tried to sort of go into initially, but then pulled out and now just bombarding with artillery. Why are they so fixated in Mariupol? Is it because of this bridge to Crimea? They just really want to have that city, including at the cost of leveling into the ground. Tonight, they issued an ultimatum to all citizens of the city to leave by 5 p.m. local, which is actually 11 o'clock Eastern time tonight. And if they don't, they'll all be treated as enemies, which seems to me like a war crime. Why are they so intent on taking this one city and not the others?
All right, so I think there's a military reason and there's a political reason. The political reason, I think, is straightforward. They want to take all the Donbass. I've been watching them revise down what I think their war aims are, and if they're searching for anything that they can claim a victory to get out of this conflict, one of the pieces they would need is to have captured most of the Donbass, and then possibly Russians will then say, well, this war was really about that, and these concessions that they're going to try to extract out of the Ukrainian leadership. So seizing Mariupol as part of the Donbass, I think, is important as a political goal. On the military side of the equation, while logistically it's not at all critical, I think they want to tie up the whole coast along the Sea of Azov. I don't think it's really so much about a land bridge to Crimea. I've never liked any of the land bridge theories. They never made much sense to me. But if they do take Mariupol, they can then free up a lot of forces to help the push from the south towards that encirclement of Ukrainian forces in the JFO. Regarding the other parts that they've taken the south, like Kherson, it's still not clear what their aims are. Are they going to try to create a Kherson People's Republic, or is that just going to be a chip that Russian leadership will seek to trade away, use as leverage, in order to attain a political settlement over other concessions they'd like to extract from Zelensky? I suspect it's more that, and rather than them wanting to partition the country.
Got it. Andrew, let's bring you in here. You spent a lot of time digging into the dark place that is Russian politics and the even darker place that is Putin's mind. Let's take us into his mind, if you can here. What is he thinking right now? Obviously, the rapid invasion did not work out. He did not take Kyiv in 3 days as he had hoped. What is he doing now? Is he willing to concede that his victory is going to be much less than what he initially desired, taking Donbass, as Mike said? Do you think he can afford to do that?
Hello, Dmitry. Hi, Mike. Yes, I think with the slow start, so to speak, of this operation, in the end, there's going to have to be a recalculation of what can be achieved on the first part. So I think we're looking at revised war aims. I do think, though, there are two parts to this. The first is that we have the military question, and the second is the political question. And the political question, in the end, if there's a kind of an insufficient military result that drives through to achieve complete political ends, this just leads to a pause, and the strategic question remains open for all of the Russian leadership who've gone in behind this. So I think for me, this is part of a rather bigger political question, resolving the policy clash, obviously with Kiev, but also there's a slightly wider question about the Euro-Atlantic security architecture. I'll probably leave it there. There's quite a lot we can unpack, but and Mike probably will have something to say about that too.
Well, just let me follow up on this, because he announced this invasion as a way to denazify, quote unquote, Ukraine. Can you really afford to leave the current government in place and it being in charge of most of Ukraine, aside from the Donbass region? Is that really going to be acceptable, just even internally, to his credibility with the Russian people?
Well, he might have to, I think. If there are questions about how far they can push the military operation further, I think there's already a question of rolling back from a regime change. Yes.
And Mike, what are your thoughts on the current state of casualties? Zelensky, in the address last night, was talking about over 14,000 dead service people, assuming that's just KIAs and not wounded. That would take us into 20,000, 30,000. Is that realistic, or do you think it's actually much less?
Well, I'm going to fall back maybe on Pentagon's talking points, who claim there are 7,000 casualties, which is about half what Zelensky claims. But what I'll say is that, look, here's the truth. I don't think we know with any high level of confidence what they are. These are at best estimates, right? And they're very incomplete picture. We also know even far less about the state of Ukrainian forces and what Ukrainian casualties are. That's actually even much darker part of those puzzles. So, working out the casualties and trying to understand what's been the rate of attrition, what combat effectiveness is left, that's really not easy. I'm sorry to give a disappointing answer, but I think it's far better to be frank about uncertainty than it is to give out numbers that betray false confidence.
But do you think, numbers aside, that he can still sustain this politically in terms of the notifications to the next of kin that are going out right now to the Russian mothers?
Oh, yeah. From that respect, I think absolutely. In fact, if anything, it's only been the last week and a half that the Russian establishment has really gotten about the business of mobilizing the public and getting public to support this war. I think they can actually hide a lot of the casualties, or if not hide, at least isolate the information and news about the casualties, so people are operating in a kind of fragmented information environment at home. I'm probably a bit less concerned about public reaction to that than I would be about, Russian elite reaction to the catastrophe that is likely to become the Russian economy. But on that front, to me, it's more of an issue of combat effectiveness and what it really does to the units, and the fact that Russian forces really will need a serious operational pause, maybe a ceasefire of some kind, if they want to reorganize and replace some of their lost combat power. Because I suspect they've had a real drop in combat effectiveness and any ability to advance in recent weeks.
And, there's a lot of excitement, Mike, over the use of this Kinzhal hypersonic missile for the first time in the last couple of days to hit a weapons storage facility in Western Ukraine. What do you make of that? Is that just what typical militaries do whenever they have a war? They want to unleash all of their new toys to justify their procurements. Is that what it is? Or is there something more to this?
I'm sorry, I'm going to disappoint folks here. As a military analyst, I see a lot of missiles hitting a lot of things on a day-to-day basis, and I'm terribly unexcited by the use of the Kinzhal. It's not even a true hypersonic weapon. It's an ALBM. And the fact that
what is that?
Air-launched ballistic missile, de facto, maybe quasi-ballistic air-launched missile, but nonetheless, there's nothing especially exciting about this weapon system. And it being used against fixed infrastructure in no way changes the game from any other missile that the Russian military has used in this conflict. I think the only thing that's happened here is that the Russian military is trying to now contest the information environment with Ukraine, right? To push out stories there that they're using some kind of advanced or really cool weapon systems in order to change or drive the news cycle somewhat. So to me, what's interesting is not the fact they used the missile. To me, what's interesting is that they're trying to inject that into the information environment because they're starting to work a little harder to contest it, whereas they started the war by completely ceding it, assuming it would be a quote-unquote special operation that would be done within a few days, and they could hide most of what happened, and they wouldn't actually have to fight for the narrative.
Yeah. And Andrew, to that point, one of the things that we're now starting to see, of course, is mobilization of the Russian public. There's continuous now auto rallies with cars waving flags with the letter Z on them that has sort of become the symbol for Russia of this invasion. We obviously saw the huge stadium that apparently included many bust-in workers working for the government that were brought in to celebrate this war, and Putin came out and gave a pretty mundane speech in support of this invasion. What do you think of the Russian public opinion right now? The economy is going into a tailspin. There's now lots of pictures of empty shelves in the supermarket for whatever reason. The Russians are buying up every piece of sugar that they can, of all things. Sugar and condoms seem to be the two things that is missing from all Russian stores right now. How much of that is going to affect Putin's popularity and his hold on power?
Well, I think two questions there already, Dmitry: his popularity and his hold on power. So let's start with the first. That this is quite difficult to tell, unfortunately, because we do see a slight bump up in popularity, and I think it's worth remembering how the leadership has sought to rally support in the past. So we look at the fairly major rallies, let's say in 2012, you'll remember, and then after the elections and around the elections, then of course there was the Krymnash rallies and so on to try to build some sense of support for this. I mean, there are fairly serious questions of arrests and so on, but at the moment it doesn't look like the popular vote is turning immediately against him. No, so I think that's one question that we have to be aware of for the longer term, but doesn't look like it at the moment. The second is about his hold on power, and it's worth saying again, just reminding that in terms of the conversation that we've been questioning Putin's hold on power since about 2005. You'll recall all the discussions that we've had more or less every 6 months about Putin's on his way out, and just the last 2 or 3 years, well, we had that with COVID too. I only say that because it's worth remembering that we've been through this. It's the end of Putin repeatedly. And so I think we need to consider quite carefully the conditions under which any kind of threat to that might emerge.
So you're a skeptic on the possibility of a coup?
At the moment, I think we need to be quite careful about that idea. Yes, I think that's how it would come and from where. There's the famous line about coups abroad. We foreigners are always the last to find out about them. But there are things that have to be borne in mind. There might be an attempted coup that fails, an attempted coup that succeeds but doesn't know where it's going. So when we start talking about a coup, that's not the end question. Also, I am at the moment a bit skeptical about that. Yes, I mean, ask me again in 6 weeks, and then and 2.5 months. But at the moment, yes.
What do you make of the spring cleaning, which seems to be a Russian tradition, going back centuries? Whenever things go wrong, to find the fall guy. Perhaps not just in Russia, but you've had now confirmed at least resignation, if not arrest, of the deputy chief of Rosguardia, Roman Gavrilov. You have the U.S. saying that the reports of the arrest of Sergei Beseda, who runs the Fifth Service of the FSB, responsible for the intelligence analysis on Ukraine. The U.S. government officials saying that is credible. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd want to place this again in the longer term context about what the arrest and particularly about the Rosguardia arrest might be for. I don't yet buy the arrests of the FSB. I'm not rejecting it, but I'd want to haggle about it, and I'd want to be sure what this was for before we said there are firings halfway through an operation. So I'm a bit equivocal about the FSB arrests at the moment.
Got it. But you don't think it's a sign that he's cracking down? He's unhappy with the information he was provided before the war about the potential easiness of this action?
Well, that's what's going around at the moment, and we'll certainly find out a little bit more as time goes on. I think that for me remains kind of speculation and rumor rather than something confirmed. So I'm a little bit uncertain about, or a little bit unsure about, pushing too hard on FSB arrests, and if it's them, well, what about the chain of command, the other chain of command, and where does that stop exactly? So again, I know we're dealing a little bit in speculation and rumors, and I don't want to put a wet sponge over what people are talking about. But I particularly with the FSB arrest, I'd like to see more evidence.
Got it. Mike, what do you think? I mean, this has been confirmed. The deputy chief of Rosguardia, Gavrilov, resignation at a minimum, maybe arrest. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it looks like standard practice for that regime. Obviously, a lot of things didn't go to plan as they expected. And Putin's unlikely to blame himself. He's likely to blame all these people. And maybe they did try to tell him what he wanted to hear. Or maybe they grossly overstated their capacities and what they could achieve in Ukraine. Either way, I'm not surprised at seeing this sort of some internal purges.
But why Rosguardia? Why not the military?
I mean, that's a really good question. And Rosguardia is important because in terms of defending the regime, they typically handle the public and mass mobilization of the public. They have been used extensively in this conflict. I think they've suffered some pretty significant casualties, actually, especially the more specialized Rosguardia units, Sober and the like. And there's also a lot of Kadyrovцы, which are technically under Rosguardia, but loyal to Ramzan Kadyrov, that are being used in a lot of the urban combat in this war.
The Chechens.
Yep, that's correct. And in fact, you can see them fighting in Mariupol. Why Rosguardia? My best guess is that there have been major mistakes maybe made by them. Early on, there were a lot of things that Rosguardia was doing that were very strange, to be perfectly honest. The first 48 hours, I couldn't actually understand what they were doing. I mean, the Russian attempt to execute a quick regime change operation by itself was bad, but Rosguardia's part of it was frankly bizarre, because they were driving by themselves to cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, unsupported, uncoordinated, like they were just going to roll into the city and start arresting people. And a lot of their troops got killed early on in some of these strange, uncoordinated attempts. So I'll be frank, I don't know specifically it's tied to their performance, to lack of coordination, or to something else within the system.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the long-term damage to the Russian military has been in terms of all this destroyed equipment that is now numbering over 1,000 pieces of armor that has been destroyed, a number of planes that have been destroyed? What is the setback to them, you think, in terms of years of procurement here?
I mean, it'll definitely take them some years to recover. Looking at procurement, I don't know, sort of I'd eyeball it at, maybe 3 years worth of procurement, but it all depends on your assumptions and expectations about the future of the Russian economy, their ability to conduct some of the more advanced defense procurement, some of those line items, and what they'll have access to. I mean, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and things like that are not very hard to replace, and trucks, and that's most of what they've lost, to be honest. Loss of...
They've lost some planes too, right?
Yeah, they've lost a couple planes, for sure. But Russia's got a very large Air Force and a very large park of rotary wing aviation as well. So their helicopter losses were significant, particularly in the attack on Kherson Airport. But nonetheless, it's a pretty large Air Force, just to clarify that for folks. So that part actually worries me the least looking out at the Russian military. I think the biggest issues are going to have to do with the force. I think they're going to have real challenges maintaining the contract component of the force, which is the majority of it, given the fact that they drummed some conscripts into signing contracts in order to be sent to this war, given they generally didn't tell the troops that they were being sent to war and put them there under false pretenses, and how they've used the troops, the poor organization, lack of support. I think they've terribly damaged the military's reputation. I can't imagine a lot of Russian young men wanting to sign a contract to serve in this military now. So, to me, I think the bigger challenge will be for the force. They'll probably have to move to a larger conscript system, maybe extend conscript service down the line if they want to maintain numbers. And of course, the bigger question is, are they going to conduct a series of reforms again? Because it's clear that, this military has performed in an incredibly unimpressive fashion. There's no other way to put it. It's done quite badly. So what they make of it still remains to be seen.
Yeah. What do you make of the Russian Air Force here? Because that's been probably one of the biggest puzzles is where's the Russian Air Force? Now we're starting to see a lot more aggressive bombing campaigns. We saw the first videos this weekend that the Russian MOD put out of the Su-35, the fourth plus generation plane that they have, first used in Syria, now apparently used to shoot down several Ukrainian fighter jets. Are you seeing more activity from the Russian Air Force? Are they getting into the fight? And do you think that the threat that Lavrov issued over the weekend to the convoys of weapons that are coming in from Poland and other countries, that those convoys might maybe attack, do you think that threat is real? Do you think they have the capacity with their Air Force to actually hit those convoys?
Well, the Air Force is a harder piece of the puzzle, just because in open sources, you can see a lot less of what's happening with air power and how it's being used than you can other aspects of Russian military power. So I guess what I'll say is that, yes, the Air Force is being used with greater frequency. I think they're in a bit of a war of attrition with Ukrainian air defense. In areas where Ukrainian air defense has been concentrated, they've continuously struggled. They're trying to take out Ukrainian air defenses, but Russian Air Force is not good at what we call seed and deed type missions, suppression or destruction of enemy air defense. In general, I've seen them being used more frequently, maybe a little bit increasingly with precision guided munitions. I don't want to delve into the topic too much because it's going to lead us to go down a bit of a rabbit hole. But in terms of use of Russian air power, it's been much more sparing than most people had expected. It really did tick up a few weeks ago. There was one really black day for the Russian Air Force where they tried to fly extensively and they lost a lot of aircraft to various Ukrainian air defense systems. On the whole, though, I have been seeing them fly more, but maybe more specific areas where they're not likely to be shot down. But generally, they're engaging in bombing with unguided munitions.
So do you think they have the capacity to hit convoys or no?
Oh, sorry, I missed the latter part of your question. It's a bit late this Sunday. I'm skeptical because I'm not sure they have the ISR for that. However, in the last week and a half, we've seen much greater use of Russian drones, right, of various types with various levels of endurance. So if they start pushing drones more into Western Ukraine, they could certainly attempt it. They could give it a try. I'm still very skeptical, though.
Yeah, they published a video of the use of the four-post drone, which is actually the Israeli-made reconnaissance UAV that they apparently are now using that has quite a bit of loiter time, right? So they could potentially use some of these to identify threats and then target them through air power.
Yeah, still a Searcher too. They got a couple others, and you see them using them more often, and also to enable targeting of artillery. They're trying to push these videos out as well to basically show that they also are using a reconnaissance strike or reconnaissance fire type complex. But to what extent that really represent much of the battlefield, it's hard to tell. I'm always wary of the distortionary effect of published media like that, right? Because you don't know what percentage of the fighting you're really seeing, and to what extent that represents a broader use of remotely operated systems or more boutique use.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you both this question. I saw a really interesting Twitter thread a few days ago from Franz Stefan Gotti from ISSS, and he made a very fascinating point that if you look at Russia's major military victories over the last few hundred years, they've been always in conjunction with allies, and particularly with allies providing significant economic support. Certainly during World War II, Lend-Lease support from the allies was instrumental, both the weapons and the food and so forth, in order for the Russians to survive the German onslaught and then push back. During Napoleon War, you had the same situation. And the cases where they did not have allies and they were fighting highly capable militaries, like during the Crimean War, where they were fighting the British and the French, they didn't do so well. And should we read anything into that, Andrew and Mike, in terms of their ability to actually fight these major wars under very severe economic conditions, like what they're about to experience, with pretty much complete isolation economically and diplomatically?
Well, look, when you come to using historical examples, you see all sorts of different things rocking up. So the Russian military in the so-called Crimean War, which wasn't at all just, of course, as you know, located to Crimea, was in the end won not on the battlefield, but by having the economy shut off, and its export economy shut off, and a raise of domestic unrest and protest. And oddly enough, much the same can be said also for the Russo-Japanese War, a number of other wars where the Russian state has been defeated in war. At the same time, it's well worth bearing in mind that the question of military victory and military defeat has a certain limited scale to it, because in those defeats that we've talked about, the Russian leadership was then able to sort of pick away and use statecraft and diplomacy and economic relations to overturn that result quite quickly. So, I think when we look at Russian military or defeat and victory in war, we look at some of the great victories, the fatherland victories, as you say. We'd think quite carefully about the allies in the Napoleonic Wars, because there's Russia and Great Britain, but most of Europe is unified in the invasion of Russia. At the same time, the Second World War, it does have Great Britain and the US. That's true, but when we start to think about Russia's defeats, the really main defeat was World War I. That's the one that leadership keeps coming back to as the complete defeat, where you have economic collapse, government collapse, and military defeat on the battlefield. So, the Russian military history shows us all sorts of different things, but it reminds us that the military is only a small part of that, and that economics and diplomacy are actually the important aspects of the strategic question of warfighting. Mike?
Yep. But I think, Franz Stefan's point was that Russia has never really won a war when it was fighting alone and under very, very difficult economic conditions like what they're about to experience. So, Mike, any thoughts on that? Do you think we're reading too much into these historical examples?
Yeah, I don't think that was Franz's real point, because I talked to him about that a little bit too. I know him quite well. But, let's put it this way. Russia appears basically more frequently than almost any other power I think, literally in militarized disputes in the last 300 years. And so, if, case selection is going to heavily drive your conclusions. That is to say, I highly doubt that's true, and I'm sure there's lots of wars where Russia fought largely by itself where it won. But if we look at big wars or great power wars, there's a couple of things that are likely true. First, most people's best victories are those they fought with allies or good coalitions. Okay, and nobody likes to admit it necessarily, but that's probably the truth. Second, to me, the more significant takeaway is that Russia has done historically poorly when it's taken on fights where coalition have sided against it. To me, that's the more interesting part of the Crimean example that Andrew thoughtfully brought up, right? And when we look again in the case of today's conflict, why it's relevant is that when Russia picks a fight and when a lot of other powers side with Russia's opponents, its likelihood of winning become very low, much lower. To me, that's a more interesting takeaway, right? I don't have a database of Russian wins and losses and how many people were involved in each fight up in front of me available right now to look back over the last 300-400 years of history to answer the other question.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, let's go back to Putin. How isolated do you think he is? I mean, obviously he is very physically isolated. We're seeing these ridiculous pictures of him sitting 30 feet apart from anyone because he is so afraid of COVID. But do you think from an information perspective, he's getting very little information right now about what is going on that is filtering through to him? Do you think he's only getting the positive news? What's your view on that?
I mean, nominally, yes, as you say, he's isolated physically because of the length of the tables that we often see, and that he's having to conduct his meetings by Zoom. I'm a little cautious about saying that he's not getting his briefings. First of all, about the war, whether good information is passed up the chain or not is a different question, and we see this in all sorts of other areas as well, where the president has to find out the information from himself. You remember there was the leak up in Norilsk, where the information chain doesn't work very well and information is not passed up. So I can well imagine that some questions are some poor information is and negative information is not passed up the chain. Yes, this is part of the problem of leading that kind of organization or that kind of state. I would say that, again, we keep coming back to this. It's one of the constant refrains of watching Russia whenever there's a crisis like this. We had exactly the same set of conversations in 2014, that Putin was isolated, he was out of touch. Same in 2012, Putin was isolated and out of touch. So and yet certain things roll on and certain things continue. So I think that we have to be quite cautious about the idea that Putin is isolated. We have to be a bit cautious about the idea also that he's getting good information. I think we often see examples where he himself calls out his ministers or others for giving him poor information.
Let's talk with Andrew a little bit about the succession plan. What does that look like now, whether voluntary or involuntary succession? Who do you think are the people that are most likely to replace him, given sort of the dynamics that he finds himself in, poor economy, probably devastated economy going into the 24 election? Do you think he's going to run again? Do you think that if he doesn't run, who might replace him?
Well, I think we're about to start to see. I mean, we were always going to be looking at that shift between the parliamentary elections of last year and the presidential elections in 24. This idea of a new generation coming through and testing out possible alternatives, I think, for 2024. I mean, it seems to me that again we have this line that a succession could be managed and could be managed carefully. And therefore, it's the passing on of a baton. I would still think that that's an idea that we would be looking at for 2024. Yes, and then we're starting to look for people who are probably a little bit younger than the president. You know, maybe 5-10 years younger. People who have proven themselves capable of even in this environment of Russian politics, let's say, of winning elections. So then you start to look at those who are in the parliament who are rising, and you start to look at the role of someone like Vyacheslav Volodin, who has consistently been part of the electoral process, so to speak, and organising that. So it seems to me that we're looking at a new generation of people. They're already coming through, Dmitry. We see this in the military. We see this in all sorts of other sectors do. Many of the ministers are comparatively young, in their late 50s or down to their mid 30s. So it seems to me it's time for this new generation to start taking up quite senior positions now, and we might well find that there is an attempt to pass the baton on to one of them.
So Volodin, of course, is the chairman of the State Duma. He's I think 8 years old. But Shoigu is not that much older, and he's the Minister of Defense. He's the ultimate survivor in Russian post-communist politics, right? He's been in government continuously since 1991 under both Yeltsin, Putin, and numerous prime ministers. Do you think that this war damages him, or do you think that he still has a significant power base in Russia? He used to be extremely popular when he was the minister of the emergency situations, basically the Russian fixer-upper. Whenever there was a crisis or a national emergency, he would always be the ones fixing it. So what does his popularity look like now?
He was the only one who, for years, the only one really who, of the ministers who were able to get double figures support. It was quite, and we remember, as you say, Dmitry, he's been at the top level of Russian politics since the early 90s, federal politics since the early 90s. He was involved in first in Unity, and then he was leading Единая Россия. So there's a lot of politics there in terms of a basis. But it seems to me that actually for several years now he's been talking about trying to retire. And I wonder if that's not an indication he's talked about going to Siberia and developing Siberia. I wonder if actually the point is less so to look at someone of the same age group, and more to look at someone who that organization could be actually supportive, to provide more dynamic support for someone else. So I'm not so sure about Sergei Shoigu being set up for the presidency. No.
Well, he definitely should be careful what he wishes for, because going to Siberia can mean something entirely different than what he is expecting. Let me ask you I asked this to Mike last week and Rob as well. I want to get your view. There's a lot of concern right now in the West about the nuclear threats that Putin is continuously bringing up. He's raised the alert of the nuclear forces. What is the likelihood that he's going to actually use a tactical nuclear weapon, either in Ukraine itself, or he's going to get into a confrontation with NATO that will lead to a nuclear exchange, in your view, Andrew?
Well, I would think this is probably, Mike's the one who's done extensive work on escalation. So I think I'm tempted to pass the ball straight to Mike. But I would say that the nature of the weapons that are likely to be used align with the delineation and military strategy of how a war is to be fought. And if we accept that this is, let's call it a special military operation, that's fine. Let's put that to one side. If we look at how military strategy defines the scope of wars, what we look at is at the top end and the bottom end. Bottom end you'd have armed conflict, and right at the top you'd have nuclear war. But in between that you have three phases, three levels of war. One is a local war, which is a war fought with general forces between two states. And then you start to move to regional and large-scale war. And it's really in the large-scale war where you start to see more strategic weaponry brought in. But then again, when you start to look at Russian escalation ladders, the nuclear weapons tend to come in quite high in the ladder. So I think unless there is a serious escalation of the war to take this to a large-scale war, we're not really looking at nuclear weapons just out of frustration with how this war is being fought or some such. This is a category change in our thinking.
Yeah, that is my view on this as well. I just don't know how he's able to justify it, even internally, to the Russian public, that he's liberating Ukraine from the Nazis, and then he's going to launch a nuclear weapon on the Ukrainian people and cause massive amounts of casualties. Even he would not be able to sell it as a defensive move on.
It's a tough sell, isn't it?
Yeah, liberating Ukrainians. What about chemical or biological? Do you think that he may use those and blame it on Ukrainians? A lot of concern right now in the West about that prospect.
Well, again, I'd say that the way that things are being discussed at the moment, I mean, I suppose two options come out of this. First, if it remains the kind of war that they're fighting, a conventional ground forces war, then still we're not looking at that kind of weapon of mass destruction being used. I suppose we come to the question of looking at whether the Russian leadership is able to, how can I put this, provide evidence that there is this biological program within Ukraine. It seems to me unlikely to be very, very convincing for most, certainly in the UK and the US. So I would still stay with the definition of conventional war. Mike may have something else to say about that, but conventional war is with general forces looks to me at the moment that kind of war that he's fighting.
Well, of course, the conventional war that he's fighting is full of war crimes, and the use of Chechens right now in Mariupol is quite troublesome because these people are quite brutal oftentimes and engage in a variety of extreme measures to torture prisoners and to commit all kinds of atrocities. Mike, what are you seeing from the Chechen contingent of these forces? They seem to be loyal to Kadyrov. Kadyrov seems to be pretty involved in this operation. How much is he driving this? How much of the operation is sort of independently being conducted by these Chechens?
I don't think he's personally driving it that much, but he is demonstrating his loyalty to Putin by sending a large number of his forces there. It feels like there's quite a few Chechens in this conflict, both in the north, in that convoy that was trying to make its way down to Kiev, and more importantly in the south as well, fighting for Mariupol. Couple comments on them. First, I obviously don't know how many of them are in this conflict. They have an outsized presence because they take so many bloody videos of themselves. It looks like they're the only Russians actually taping themselves in this war, and they're just constantly videotaping promos of themselves in this fight. I'm not even sure they have that much time to fight. I'm being facetious, of course, but the number is probably substantial. They tend to, at least they appear to have high morale, and they generally tend to have better kit. I suspect Kadyrov personally spends a lot more money. They definitely look better equipped than the average Russian infantryman in terms of what they were sent with. I mean, other than that, I can't add much more. Judging by some of the videos they make, you won't be surprised when I tell you they're clearly not very familiar with the Geneva conventions and laws of armed conflict.
Or they don't bother to be acquainted with them. Andrew, why is good?
Yeah,
go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, yeah, those folks don't strike me as the kind that spend their evenings reading up on international law.
Yeah, some of the videos that are coming out of prisoners of war, Ukrainian prisoners of war that Chechens captured are not pleasant to watch. Andrew, why is Kadyrov so in on this conflict? Why does it matter to him?
That's a very good question, one that definitely deserves an answer. I think that all sorts of different capabilities are being used in the conflict, and of course you'd want to try and bring in as much support across the board as possible. So you've got a variety of different capabilities within the conflict. So military, but also Rosgvardia, and then you have also this sense of bringing Chechens in, which is it's a propaganda threat. I think Mike is probably more focused on the use of the particular kinds of troops, but it's a propaganda question, it seems to me.
Do you think that this is a way for Kadyrov to extract additional concessions from Putin potentially if Putin ends up owning to Kadyrov, or potentially take Mariupol and perhaps even other places around Ukraine?
Such as, I mean, what other concessions would he be looking for within that? I mean, he seems to have quite a serious bunch of concessions already within the Russian political landscape. So, I mean, what kind of concessions would be looking for?
It's a good point. He may have everything he needs. Mike, what should we be looking to in the coming weeks? You mentioned that there might be an operational pause on the last show, that the Russians are sort of at the end of their logistics and exhaustion. How long do you think they would need to resupply and reorganize for continued fight? Is this something that's going to take a week, or are we looking potentially at a longer sort of stalemate. And what do you make of the fact that we appear to be finding trenches being dug up by Russian forces? Is this about to turn into World War I style trench warfare?
I don't think it's about to turn to World War I trench warfare, but I do think we're going to start to see consolidation of fronts and definitely an operational pause. I think you're already seeing it on most of the fronts in terms of how the fighting has been going. I think that it depends on how many additional units the Russian military pushes to the front. They clearly are moving units up from other parts of Russia, right? I think I want folks to be aware that, yes, Russian military has a lot more forces that it can generate. It's a big lift for them, but they can do it. There's a lot more Russian military power still available to some extent. There are also reservists in the Russian military that they could call up, which obviously are going to be of much lower quality. I don't think overall they are prepared or they were thinking about a long war, but they have choices that they can make. And if they want to, they can go down the route of more general national mobilization. They have a lot of manpower and material. I think what we should look for in the coming week is first, what happens in the Donbass? Does the Russian attempt to encircle Ukrainian forces there? And then second, whether or not, this operational pause translates into a ceasefire, and then that ceasefire eventually leads us to some settlement, or we enter a different chapter in this war where it's likely to become more of a war of attrition, in which case I think it's going to get even uglier than it has been. I think we're going to have even more bombardment of civilian population centers, and they are just less sanguine in general about the trajectory of the war if that's what it becomes. Other than that, it's very hard to see anything in conflict. There are a few things as contingent and sort of indeterminate as war, and a lot is just contingent there.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make? There are videos coming out tonight out of Belarus, the area near Brest, which is close to the Polish border and Western Ukrainian border, that there's seems to be an aggregation of Belarusian forces there. They have painted red square on some of their vehicles. Obviously, we saw painting of Z's and V's on Russian vehicles prior to the invasion that started on February 24th. Do you think that might be an indication that Belarus is going to get into this fight? Lukashenko made statements last week that he has no interest in going into Ukraine and that Russia doesn't need Belarus and Ukraine. But what do you make of these developments?
It's a good question. I've seen that too. Honestly, I don't know. I'm skeptical Belarus is going to intervene. I don't think they're going to make a tremendous difference, that's for sure. If the Russian military can't do it, I can't expect the Belarusian military is going to make tremendous impact. That said, they could be used as, to be honest, they could be used as a pinning force to maybe pin some amount of Ukrainian forces in that western part of the country more as a distraction. That's an alternative interpretation.
Could they use them to cut off resupply routes from Poland?
Potentially, but you don't know what Ukrainian defense is capable of in that part of the country either, right? They could actually get bogged down quite easily themselves. Mm-hmm. And it all depends on what Lukashenko says. Well, how much heed can you pay to what Lukashenko says either way?
Right. What do you both think for the prospects of negotiated outcome? Zelensky is kind of making contradictory statements on that in his address to his people every night. He keeps talking about negotiations being the only way out. I don't think he believes himself that he can actually defeat the Russian forces. And he's even said that wars always end in negotiated outcome. But then again, he keeps reiterating that Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian territorial integrity is not negotiable. It's hard to see how any negotiation succeeds where there's not at least a compromise on Crimea and potentially parts of the Donbass. What do you guys think are the prospects for a negotiated outcome in the very near future? Andrew, we'll start with you.
Well, negotiated outcome, when we say the near future, within a month.
Within weeks, yeah.
Within a week or within a month?
2 weeks, let's say.
Okay, 2 weeks. Well, I think Mike's spoken a bit about the structure of the situation, how difficult also it is to judge that. But I think we could easily come to the situation where a negotiated outcome is achieved, a ceasefire, whether that ends up being a ceasefire that takes us through to the summer, or whether that's a ceasefire that takes us through to a more substantive pause over a month, over a few months, or a couple of years, is difficult to tell, because it doesn't resolve the policy clashes between Moscow and Kiev. So, when we talk about a ceasefire, all we're doing is putting a plaster over this fairly major dispute. So unfortunately, when we talk about this, a military stalemate, or even military victory or military defeat, we're talking really about the bigger term problem of a return to try to fight this out at a different period later. So yes, very possibly we find some negotiated pause, but that's really what we're looking at, as a pause.
Do you agree with that, Mike? Is it just going to be a pause, or do you think there could actually be a real conflict resolution here?
It depends. I mean, yeah, I agree with Andrew, but you're likely to get a ceasefire, some agreement, when both sides feel relatively exhausted, right? You have to have both sides have expectations of the future trajectory of the conflict, where they believe that militarily they're unlikely to make further gains, and that their position will deteriorate. Unfortunately, neither side usually has necessarily an objective understanding of the battlefield, right? So we're highly dependent on Vladimir Putin actually having an accurate perception of what's going on with Russian forces and their prospects for any further success, and the same thing being true of Zelensky. So all things being equal, right, as an analyst, I could guess that in the next couple of weeks, there's likely to be this culminating point, probably for both sides. And or at the very least for the Russian side. And that could lead to a ceasefire, or at least it could motivate both sides to pursue a ceasefire. It all depends on whether or not they could agree, right? If there's a sufficient meeting ground between Russian demands and, what Zelensky is likely to be able or willing to concede.
Of course, if there's just a ceasefire pause, it's unlikely the Russians would withdraw from the significant gains they've made in the Donbass and south in the Kherson area and in the north. So that could potentially be a very problematic ceasefire for Zelensky, given that part of this country a bigger part of this country will remain occupied by Russia. Well, on that note, we're going to end it there. Thank you so much for coming to this Twitter space. I hope you found this discussion informational and fascinating. And thank you so much, Mike, again, for coming back, and Andrew, for your insights into the Russian political system. Please follow them both. Andrew has a terrific book on the Russian political system. I encourage you all to read it. And of course, follow Mike on Twitter and elsewhere. He is everywhere these days. But thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your insights with us tonight, and hope to see you guys soon. Take care.
Thanks for having me on the program.
Thank you.